All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kanchan Saxena, and I am a cybersecurity compliance auditor and IT security consultant here at CyberCube Services. CyberCube offers various services in the field from conducting compliance audits against different standards such as PCI DSS, ISO 27001, 27701, SOC, GDPR, and many more and also provides technical consultation by conducting various vulnerability assessments, pen testing, red teaming activities, source code reviews, and so on. Now, with years of experience in conducting compliance audits and drafting reports, I am thrilled to share insights from the front lines today. Thank you for joining today's webinar on a topic I believe is one of the most overlooked yet most dangerous risk in the PCI DSS compliance: third party risk management. Now, let me start with a question first. How many third parties do you think have access to your cardholder data right now? Think about it. Payment processors, cloud providers, managed service providers, SaaS platforms, and even the auditors. The list goes on, right? And here's the uncomfortable truth: most organizations can't even identify them all, right? In my experience, I have observed that vendors are provided with remote access to platform and their tasks to perform their tasks, but the access is kept open, right? And there are inadequate access controls or security controls in place. Now it is very easy for anyone to exploit this weakness and grant access to the cardholder data environment. Now, what can be the cost of this? Heavy penalties in legal settlements, and not to mention the reputational damage and the defamation, right? Now, this is why third party risk management is not just a compliance checkbox, it's your organization's liability. When a third party fails to secure cardholder data, your organization bears the responsibility and the consequences. Now, with this webinar, today we'll be exploring why the third parties are silent killers of the PCI DSS compliance, what the standard actually requires, the risks you might be missing, and most importantly, how to build a sustainable third party management program. So let's begin. And before we dive into the, you know, any third party requirements, let's, let's just understand what is PCI DSS and why does it matter. So PCI, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards, is managed by the Security Standards Council, which is an independent body created in 2006 by five of the major payment card brands: Visa, MasterCard, American Express, JCB, and Discover. And recently, UnionPay has also been added. Now, the council develops and maintains the PCI DSS standard, while the card brands themselves enforce it through their individual programs, by setting the fines, penalties, compliance mandates for the merchants and the service providers. Now, one may ask, who must attain the PCI DSS compliance? So any organization that stores, processes, or transmits the cardholder data, including the merchants such as retailers, e-commerce, service providers such as payment gateways, payment processors, and even the third-party vendors who are accessing the cardholder. Now, the PCI DSS standard itself gives 12 requirements to manage and maintain the security posture of the CD, right? Here's the critical piece: PCI DSS doesn't operate in isolation. It's designed around a shared responsibility model, right? You can outsource your payment process to the third parties, but you cannot outsource your liability. If your payment processor or hosting provider or cloud vendor fails to meet any of the PCI DSS requirements, your organization is non-compliant, period. And the painful truth, most organizations focus on their own PCI DSS requirements and assume that the vendors are handling their security, but they're not. Many of the third party service providers are running on legacy systems. They might have poor access controls and they treat security as an afterthought. This is why requirement 12.8 exists to force these organizations to actively manage and monitor the third party risks. Now, the third party risk management wasn't always a formal PCI DSS pillar, right? Earlier versions focused, mainly on the internal controls, but some of the high profile breaches exposed how the external dependencies create massive blind spots, right? And the council, how did they respond? They responded by evolving, requirement 12 in version 3.2. And then finally, they significantly strengthened it in version 4.0. And they made 12.8 a comprehensive framework for the TPRM, right? Now let's dissect this PCI DSS version 4.0.1 requirement 12.8. What does it say? Establish and implement policies and procedures to manage the service providers with which cardholder data is shared or that could impact the security of the cardholder data. Now, this single requirement is divided into 5 actionable sub-requirements, each mapping, to a critical phase of the third-party life cycle, from inventorying to accountability, making sure that no vendors becomes your weak link, right? So, in the next few slides, we will get into the specifics of this requirement 12.8. We will identify some of the common oversights and understand the action items for your organization. So let's move to this first requirement, which brings us to maintain a list of all the third-party service providers. Now, this sounds simple, but it's where the most organizations fail, right? You must maintain a comprehensive inventory of all the third-party service providers that may have access to the cardholder data, or they can, impact the security of the cardholder data. Now, what does this list include? It should include, the third party name and contact information. They should include service description, what specifically are they doing? If you say that they're just cloud hosting, that's too vague. You need to mention the specifics, like AWS EC2 instances, hosting payment processing API. This is descriptive, right? So a proper description should be mentioned. Then comes to data classification. This list can also include what cardholder data are the third parties, have access to. Maybe they can have PAN, they have expiry date, they have CVV, CVC, whatsoever. Now, what's the problem here? Many organizations use spreadsheets that are outdated, they are less informative, and they're not at all connected to the reality, right? Maybe a vendor you might have offboarded 3 years ago might still be on the list. Whereas, like a critical SaaS platform that you adopted 6 months ago is not present. Let's come to the common oversights that the organizations miss out. When maintaining the list of the third parties, you forget about the remote support vendors, right? There might be some vendors who got access one time, but that access is still present, right? There are cloud backup providers, there are audit and compliance firms, there are development and testing vendors, and even subcontractors of your primary vendors, right? Like your payment processor's payment processor. These should be included in the list, but they are often missed out. What are the action items you say that you can take from this, what you can do to ensure that this requirement is compliant for us? We can implement a centralized vendor inventory system, not a spreadsheet, maybe a proper TPRM platform that you can adopt, right? You can conduct quarterly reconciliation to catch any shadow IT. You can assign a vendor owner for each of the third parties, right? Now, once a list and an inventory is maintained, this brings us to the next part, which is 12.8.2, maintain written agreements with all the third-party service providers. Now, here's where compliance gets contractual. Every third party that has access to the cardholder data must be, under formal legal agreement. And that agreement should explicitly state these points, right? Firstly, when we say acknowledgement of responsibility, the third party acknowledges that they are responsible for the security of cardholder data that they store, process, or transmit on behalf of your organization, right? Then you can add the security requirements, right? The agreement must include the details of what PCI DSS controls they will implement, how the encryption standards they are implementing, what are the standards they are using, how they are managing the access control policies, right? What are the incident notification timeframes that are there? And you can also include the audit and monitoring rights for your organization, correct? Now, coming to the third point being liability and indemnification. What happens? What happens if they breach? Who's liable? You have to define whose liability it is if this thing is breached, if this agreement is breached. This is very critical, right? Then there is breach notification. Once a breach occurs, they must notify you within so and so hours, and you need to define that framework. Maybe 24 hours, in 72 hours, or whatsoever. And lastly, you must retain the audit rights. That is, you can audit them, you have the right to audit them, you can request for the evidences, you can validate their compliance posture. Many of the organizations I've noticed does not know that they have the right to audit their third parties, right? And why does this matter? Why do we need to create this agreement so properly? Because a written agreement creates legal accountability, right? Now, if the third party claims that they didn't know they had to encrypt the data, right? The agreement proves that they did. If they do not respond to your audit request, they are in the breach of contracts, right? Which brings us to what are the common agreement failures that that the organizations fail and fail to achieve or fail to add within the agreements. The agreements might contain some vague language like we will maintain the industry security standard, right? There is no incident notification clause. Any breach happens, who will notify? What time is it that you have to notify the affected parties? There is nothing like that in the agreement, right? The agreement might not include any audit rights for the organization, right? The agreements sometimes are outdated, maybe signed 5 something years ago, and they have not been updated as per the new clauses, as per the new standard, right? Then mostly what I have also observed is that the agreements are very generic. They do not specifically mention any PCI DSS pointers, right? It's a very generic SLA that you're using. Now, seeing what are the common agreement failures, understanding what should be added, now comes what needs to be done from your end. The action items that you can take from this requirement is, you can develop a PCI specific third party agreement template, right? Specifically for each of the vendors, each of the category of vendors, right? Then you can ensure that legal and security teams are approving the language of the agreement that you're preparing, right? And the agreement also requires, it also requires acknowledgement from the third parties as well. And you should be able to track the agreement when it is expiring, what are the renewal dates. We have to be very, on points and on tiptoes when it comes to the agreement. Okay. Now, before moving forward, I would just like to understand if we are on the same page and if everybody is understanding till now whatever we have explained. If I can get something from anyone, right? Okay, I believe that we are understanding everything. So let's move to the third sub requirement, which is 12.8.3, which talks about conducting pre-engagement due diligence. Now, before you can, you let a third party touch your data, you must investigate them thoroughly, right? For this, what you can do is you can create a due diligence. You can form a process, right? Now, what can this due diligence cover? It can cover your financial standing. Is the vendor financially stable? Will they be around in 2 years? If not, then what will happen? Financial instability, often leads to cost cutting corners of the security. Now, what else it can include? Cybersecurity posture. What are their security certifications? If they are PCI, compliant, if they're ISO compliant, if they're SOC compliant, what is their incident history? Have they been breached within this year? Right? How did they respond to these incidents? What were the actions taken on it? Right? The due diligence can also cover compliance track records, like are they compliant with the relevant standards? If let's say that they work in some healthcare industry, so do they have HIPAA compliance? If they process EU data, then are they GDPR compliant? You can ask these questions with your due diligence form, right? You should also include operational dependencies. For example, let's say, you know, does your third party rely on any subcontractors for any process? If so, then who is that third party? You need to understand how they are working with their third party. Are they sharing any cardholder data with them? If yes, then are they also looking at that third party, that subcontractor, if they are compliant or not? This is your responsibility to check, and this is your responsibility to ask them. Then, lastly, we can also include security controls, right? Like ask them about access management. Do they have multi-factor authentication in place? Are they following role-based access, least privilege or not, right? What are the encryption methods they are using? How they are encrypting the data at rest? How they're encrypting the data in transit? What are the logging and monitoring tools they are using? How they're, retaining the logs, monitoring the logs, what is their incident response process, how they are conducting the backup and disaster recovery, and so on and so forth. Now, once we have created a proper due diligence form, right, you may ask what are the methods, how we can create this due diligence form. So there are like different methodologies you can use. Maybe you can create a security questionnaire, right? There are PCI, the council also provides some of the standard templates that you can use. You can just customize that template based on your, categorization of the vendors according to the risk. Maybe for high risk vendors, a different questionnaire. For low risk vendors, you're asking less questions because we do not need to ask them about the security of the cardholder data, right? Then you can adopt a method of review of the documentation. You can ask for them for their PCI AOC. You can ask for their PCI report on compliance. You can ask them for the SOC 2 compliance, for the ISO certification, and check whether the services that they are providing you is also included in that compliance or not, right? Then include the reference checks, right? Talk to them about their existing customers, right? How they are maintaining the security practices. You can get in touch with their existing customers and references, right? And lastly, conduct the technical assessments, right? If possible, if feasible, you can conduct a technical scan for any high risk vendor. You can just request for a vulnerability assessment to be conducted of their system. Or if they have already conducted one, you can simply ask them for their reports, right? Now, this whole thing is a risk based approach, right? We say that not all vendors are equal, right? Maybe some vendors have direct access to the cardholder data, like a payment processor, which needs more rigorous due diligence than any vendor who is a low risk vendor, like somebody who's just providing us office supplies, right? You can tailor your assessment according to the sensitivity of the data they are accessing. So, which brings us to what are the action items you can take from this one? Firstly, develop a risk-based vendor categorization system, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And then create assessment templates for each category, right? The questions may vary for the high risk vendor, and it may vary from for the low risk vendor, right? You can you should also document all these findings and the decisions that are done here. And finally, also ensure to take acknowledgements from the security or business stakeholders before onboarding or engaging with any vendor, because your management should also be aware that yes, this is a vendor that we are going to assign now, and we'll work with them. So we have everything in place. We have our agreement prepared, clearly defining what are the PCI DSS requirements and responsibilities. And then we have also conducted the due diligence. We are good to go with this vendor. You can take a sign off from your security and business stakeholders, right? Now, finally, this brings us to our next point, which is conduct annual assessments of the third-party service providers. As we all know, that compliance is not a one-time event, right? Once we have onboarded any vendor, you need to continuously monitor their compliance posture. At least annually, we should conduct a formal assessment, right? Now, what should this assessment include, right? What all you should assess? Before going to that, I would like to tell you, why are we conducting this annual assessment? Why is it needed? Why can't we just simply say that we can conduct biannually or whenever we change any vendor? No, we have to make sure that at least once in a year, we are conducting the assessments to ensure that, if any systems were upgraded at the vendor's end, right? They might have introduced some new vulnerabilities, right? So that can be covered up this during these assessments, right? Then, has any security incidents occurred within this whole year, right? If yes, then how they responded to it? How did they track up this breach? What actions did they take on it, right? The staff within the year might have changed. So you can check if the new hires are lacking any security training, or are they well aware of what the data is there present with them, and what's the how are they handling it, how they have to ensure that they have to maintain the confidentiality of that data, right? Then you can also identify if any changes in the subcontractors is present, like they might have changed their subcontractor, they might have changed their payment processor, right? This can be also identified during this annual assessment. And finally, if they are still compliant or not, has their compliant certification expired or not, right? Now, this brings us to what you should assess. As you can see, firstly, you should assess the current AOC and the ROC document. Request them for their latest audit attestation, right? Check it is current or not, if they are still valid or not, if the AOC document and the ROC document is including the services that they are providing to you, right? Then secondly, you should also check the incident history, right? Have they reported any incidents in this past 12 months? How did they respond to it? What were the lessons they have learned from it, so that it is not repeated again? Thirdly, expiration of their certifications. As I mentioned, are their ISO, SOC 2, PCI DSS certifications still valid? Many vendors actually let this expire. They might have had their PCI certification maybe in 2023, and they still think that they are compliant in 2026. They have not even undergone their recertification. That can be the case. So we have to check these certifications, right? Now, if there are any changes in the scope, right? Have they changed their infrastructure? Have they added any new subcontractors? Have they added even more services that they are going to provide us right now, right? Are we compliant, or are we even checking now, because they have expanded their services, what are the controls that will be applicable on them? And we have to also then, you know, update our agreement eventually. Then, coming to the last one, compliance with agreed controls. Are they still implementing the controls that were outlined in your agreement? You have the right to check these things, right? Now, what are the common gaps which we have identified during these annual assessments, right? There might be some expired compliance certificates, as I mentioned. They were certified in 2023. Their expiration, their certificate has expired already, right? They might be using some unsecured FTP configurations, right? They might have some unpatched systems within their infrastructure, right? They might be using some shared administrative credentials, and there is no tracking of who is making any changes, right? They have, you know, there's no formal incident reporting procedure that they have defined already, right? And maybe also that they are adding the new subcontractors without notifying you, because you know your organization is uh, linked with that third party, but they are changing the subcontractors, you are not notified at all. What can be the action items you say that we can take from this? Create annual assessment calendars, right? Automate reminders for the third parties. Send them reminders that you have to, you know, join for this meeting. Tell us about your compliance status, right? Document all the assessment findings, right? And ensure that you're tracking any remediation actions and taking up follow-ups. And if, let's say, that still there is non-compliance from the vendor's side, you can escalate it, right? And finally, maybe the management at that time may take the decision of not continuing with this vendor. Now, once we have conducted the annual assessments, we have created the agreements, we have created the inventory, everything is done. This brings us to the last sub requirement of 12.8, which is establish accountability, right? This is the most important thing that we have to ensure. This is where, you know, clarity prevents blame shifting. Okay. A responsibility matrix needs to be created from the scratch. It's nothing but just like a table that clearly documents what are the PCI DSS requirements and who is responsible for that requirement. Is it your organization? Is it the third party? Or is it shared between the both of you? Now, before we look at how an ideal responsibility matrix should look like, I think we should understand why is it needed? Why does this matter? Why do we need to create a a responsibility matrix, right? Because firstly, accountability. Everyone knows what they are responsible for. It is very clearly mentioned in the responsibility matrix. Is it your responsibility? Is it third party? Is it shared between the both of you, right? It also gives us audit clarity. Like during these audits, you can point to the matrix and show your auditor who's responsible for what, whatever requirement, right? It also prevents us from any gaps, like because of responsibility matrix, no requirement falls through the cracks, correct? Then, coming to the dispute resolution, right? If any breach occurs, the matrix actually clarifies who was supposed to implement which control. Now, many leading organizations make this matrix publicly available to build the stakeholder trust, right? Customers can see exactly how their cardholder data is being protected and with whom is it being shared, and whose responsibility is it to ensure the security of the customer data. Coming to what are the action items you can take here is firstly, develop a responsibility matrix. Specifically, I would say for each third party, define under each requirement who's responsible for them, right? Update this matrix when there is any change in the agreement, right? Review this responsibility matrix annually and ensure that it is well updated before the next audit, right? Use this matrix during the incident response to determine, who was accountable for this breach. Is it you? Is it the third party? And then accordingly, we can take action, right? Now, once we have discussed why is it needed, let's see actually how a responsibility matrix should look like, right? This, we come to this slide. Now here, if you see, we have clearly defined according to the requirements, right? Let's say firewall policy. Who's managing the firewall root sets? Your organization, okay? Then document security configuration, okay? Maybe it is shared between the third party and you. Both of you are responsible for ensuring the configurations, right? Then encryption of the stored cardholder data. The cardholder data is being stored at the third party's end. So it is their responsibility to ensure that it is encrypted, right? Then user access assignment. You are managing your own organization's user access. So it's your responsibility. Information security policy. Your organization is responsible for creating and maintaining the information security posture. So you are responsible for the same. So this way you can create a detailed responsibility matrix, categorize it as per the third parties, and also communicate the same to them so that they are well aware of what are the responsibilities that they have and they are accountable for the same. Now that we have covered what the standard requires, let's talk about why are the organizations failing at this, right? There are so many gaps over here that we have observed throughout the compliance journey, right? So firstly, let's talk about the first gap, which is lack of visibility. Most organizations don't really know who their vendors are, right? This sounds absurd, but it's true. You might have some shadow vendors, like departments might have hired some consultant without IT involvement, correct? There can be some forgotten vendors, right? Services like you contracted maybe years ago that are still running. They have not been updated. Then there can be some of the hidden dependencies, yeah, like your payment processor using a third party processor that you are unaware of. What's the result of this? You can't comply with 12.8.1 because you don't have a complete inventory, correct? Coming to the second gap, spreadsheet management. Okay, when I talk about the spreadsheets, I have seen that these spreadsheets are mainly outdated. They are so error prone. Like they have problems such as, they're not connected to the real time data. There are multiple versions floating around because there are multiple people who are making changes to that spreadsheet, right? There is no there is no audit trail of who updated the sheet, what was updated, when was updated. There's no document control or any version control maintained for that, right? There is it is very difficult to track the compliance dates and any expiration dates, right? A spreadsheet might tell you that, as I mentioned, a vendor's AOC, they were compliant in 2023, but now it's 2026, and no one has remembered to update the sheet. That's why spreadsheets are not exactly the ideal way that you should go with, right? You can adopt some third party risk management tools that are available, which we'll talk about later, right? Coming to the next gap, which is insufficient due diligence. So what happens is many organizations accept that their vendors who are claiming that we are PCI DSS compliant, they just accept it. They're not verifying the same. What are the red flags over here? Firstly, when a vendor says that they are PCI DSS compliant, but they're not able to prove their compliance, like they cannot provide their AOC or their ROC, right? They claim that they are compliant, but their certification might have expired years ago, right? They provide with you with a SOC 2 report that has been redacted so heavily you can't even verify anything, right? The vendors sometimes deflect. They say that we can't share any detailed information because this is confidential, this is very sensitive, right? These are the red flags that you can search for in a vendor. What's the result? Finally, you have onboarded a very high risk vendor without understanding their actual security posture, right? Bringing us to our fourth gap, annual assessment as a compliance checkbox. I mean, many organizations conduct these annual assessments, but they're not actually reviewing them, right? They receive an AOC, they file it, they move on. Nobody is actually verifying, is that AOC, scope, is that AOC scope relevant to the services that they're providing to you? Has their AOC been updated since the last review or not? Right? What are the findings they report? What were the like? How were they remediated? Everything is mentioned in the AOC, but we do not have a look or review that. We do not check if the services have been included or not. Right? Then there is like no responsibility matrix which we have maintained. Like we have not formally documented a responsibility matrix dividing it as per the requirements, right? It creates an ambiguity, to be honest. During the incidents, like a breach occurs, the organization says that's vendor's responsibility, the vendor says that's your responsibility. Meanwhile, your auditor is asking for evidence as to who was supposed to implement the control, and we have no answer in there because we did not define a responsibility matrix enough to understand who's responsible of what process, right? There's like another gap that we've identified, which is inadequate incident response procedures. Like if a vendor is breached, do you have a formal process to find out immediately what happened, what was the breach? Is there a process for notifying the affected parties, right? Was there any impact on the cardholder data that is there because of the breach, right? uh, are we like adjusting the risk profile accordingly or not? Many organizations don't look at this, and they create a very generic incident response procedure. They create different SLAs and periods as to how to take action on them, but that's not being followed in the real time. It's just there on paper, but it's not being followed. It's your responsibility to check the same, right? Then lastly, subcontractor blind spots, right? Vendors use subcontractors, and organizations often don't track these, right? For example, let's say that your payment processor uses a third party for data hosting. Now, the hosting provider is breached, but your compliance is at risk because you aren't aware of the dependency, correct? Now, these seven gaps, from visibility failures to to subcontractor blind spots, they aren't just theoretical. They have happened in real organizations, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Like, in fact, every major breach we'll examine in the next few slides traces back to one or more of these gaps. Like, let me show you how these failures have played out in the real world, and more importantly, what each organization should have done differently, right? So, before I start with the real world cases, I would like to understand if there are any queries, if we are understanding till now what has happened. Anyone? I would really like to have some responses. Are we good? Can we move forward? Yes, I guess we are good to move forward then. Okay, then let's see some real incidents, right? Which brings us to our first case study, which happened in 2013 at Target. As we all know, that Target is a very famous supermarket brand, right? But what happened here was that Target was breached through a third party air conditioning vendor. Okay, the vendor had VPN access to Target's network for some remote monitoring, and they did not have adequate security controls in place. What eventually it led to is that the vendor credentials were compromised, and the attackers used those credentials to access Target's internal network and eventually reach the cardholder data environment. In result, 40 million credit card numbers were stolen. Right now, we see that this is a case where what are the lessons we can learn. We have to seek what are the lessons here, right? So firstly, we can say that even the vendors without direct access to the cardholder data can be the entry points, right? It can be the weak points. Any attacker can simply exploit that weakness and access our cardholder data environment, right? We can also learn that access management for these third parties are a crucial point, right? If it is inadequate, if it is not proper, it's a problem for us, right? We can also see that there was no segmentation as such between the vendor access and the sensitive systems, which is their internal cardholder data. That is why the breach happened. Okay, let's see another case actually. Okay, which brings us to the this case of British Airways, which happened in 2018. Now, what happened exactly was that attackers injected malicious code into a third-party service that this British Airways used on their website. Okay, then what happened was that the attackers code which was injected, it skimmed all the payment card information from the passengers browsers to the attackers directly, right? In result, around 3,80,000 card transactions were compromised. And what was the impact on British Airways? They were fined for about 184 million euros under GDPR. Though the case is still being appealed, but it's a heavy penalty that they had to incur. Correct. Let's come to what are the lessons you can learn from this case. So you can see that third party software dependencies are attack vectors. Like they can easily be attacked if they do not have a proper security posture, right? You must validate the security of any of your third party integrations. Ensure that they do not have that they are investigated properly for any skimming, correct? Then you can create like a responsibility matrix. Monitor that. Are they following the same or not? Eventually, from these cases, we learn that third parties, we usually ignore this, but they are like the biggest risk for us. Which brings me to our next section of the whole webinar, which is building a sustainable third party risk management program. We have identified the gaps, right? Let's talk about the solution. Solution is here. We can create and build a very a proper party risk management program, right? It can be created like in different phases. There are 5 phases that I can give you, right? Firstly, phase 1, create inventory and categorization. Usually, this phase takes a bit more time, right? It's not just like a week's task. It can take up to 1 or 2 months to properly create, identify what are the who are the vendors that are there, right? Properly create an inventory, conduct, across all departments, conduct the vendor discovery, see the contracts, the logs, then categorize these third parties into different risk categories, right? High risk vendors, maybe mm, they have direct access to the cardholder data, right? Medium risk vendors, they might have like indirect access to your cardholder data, like IT support or anything, right? Then low risk vendors who does not impact the CD at all, right? Such as office supply vendors, your HR tool vendors or HRMS vendors, right? You can like build a centralized inventory using maybe a TPRM platform that is suggested, right? Then finally, let's come to second phase. Once an inventory is created, we have to conduct a due diligence, right? Create tailored questionnaires for different categories of vendors, right? Collect their AOCs, their SOC 2 reports, uh, check for their financial statements and previous references, their existing customers, right? Perform technical scans for them. And finally, also get executive sign off before onboarding any new vendor, because your management should also be aware that you're onboarding some new vendor and what are these responsibilities that they will be handling for us. Correct? Coming to phase 3, formal agreements and matrices. Now, this is one of the phase which can take up to maybe 2 to 3 months, we can say, because we are now creating agreements which are tailored as per specific vendors according to the risks. Like you are covering the controls they are handling, you're covering what are the incident notification processes that they would be following, you're covering your audit rights, you're covering their liability. Building this responsibility matrix will showcase us who's responsible for what PCI control. And you should also get annual acknowledgements from the third parties for this agreement, because they are also aware of what they are doing. Correct? Then phase 4 is, continuous monitoring and annual assessments. Now, this is an ongoing process. This never stops, right? So what you can do is you can create calendars, maybe for annual reviews. You can request for fresh AOCs. You can validate the scope. You can validate any incidents that might have happened. You can track the remediation for them, right? You can also use some monitoring tools for this, like the TPRM tools that are present right now. They provide us with with various features, even real-time monitoring for the third parties, right? Then comes the last phase, which I have seen that mostly people use a very generic SLA that they prepare for incident response, right? But whatever is present in the policy might not be followed in the real time, right? Like you have said that if there is any critical change, it should be the action should be taken within 5 days. Maybe it's what written in the policy, but what exactly is being followed by the third party is that they are now taking action on that critical ticket maybe within like 8 days. They have already breached that SLA, right? Then you can, when we say offboarding, it's mostly the offboarding of your vendors. So once you have decided that you want to let go of any vendor, what all things you should keep in mind is that their accesses have been revoked, right? We have retrieved any cardholder information that they might have, or at least we have verified that they have securely deleted that data, right? And finally, we have to update the inventory accordingly, like whichever vendor has been offboarded, they have been removed from the inventory and it has been updated with the document control. Now, this life cycle, this complete TPRM life cycle ensures that requirement 12.8 is not just compliant, but it's embedded in your operations, right? When we say, when we say TPRM program, right? But building this TPRM program requires a lot of effort, right? It requires the right tools, it requires proper processes beyond just manual tracking. So, herein, let's talk about what are some of the best practices that you can follow. Firstly, TPRM platforms. Ditch these spreadsheets. Consider implementing a vendor risk management platform. Okay. It offers, as I mentioned, many features like centralized inventory, right, for the real-time visibility. It offers like automated questionnaires that you can create as per the categories of different vendors, right? It provides you with compliance tracking, right? It also provides you with automated alerts. If any certifications are expiring, it will alert you that we have to check for the new certification, right? It provides you with customized dashboards for better insights, right? There is like dynamic risk scoring present based on the financial health, based on the incidents that may have occurred or their overall cyber posture, right? And finally, they also provide you with a complete audit trail for the QSA reviews. So these platforms that you may see, they can be integrated with your ITSM tools, right? It mainly can also reduce the onboarding time for any vendor from weeks to just days, ensuring that everything is in place. Secondly, what you can adopt is questionnaire templates, right? You can use the standardized templates that are present online. Like, for example, PCISSC's, there's this third party security questionnaire that you can use, right? There is SANS critical security control templates that are present, right? And then you can just simply take these standard templates and customize it according to your risk tier, right? According to your vendors, you can simply customize it. For the high risk third parties, add specific PCI questions such as encryption, access control, login, so on and so forth, right? Like, create the document control and maintain the version control of your templates. Also, ensure to train your team to consistently maintain the same, because this is where we have seen most of the organizations lag. They forget to train their new hires that they will have to maintain the document control of any policy or the responsibility matrix or anything, right? Coming to the next best practice, responsibility matrix, right? You can create a standardized format, you can reuse it for every vendor, ensure that it is like uh, divide, it's created according to the different risk of vendors, right? It includes columns for like evidence requirements, review frequency, what's the status of this for this vendor, are they compliant, are they at risk, are they non-compliant, right? And then finally review and update this matrix quarterly, or maybe after, if there is any change in the scope. So this single document can resolve like 80% of your audit disputes, because during the time of audit, the auditors are asking you what are the shared controls, who's responsible for what. Simply showcase them this responsibility matrix, and all your questions would be answered, right? Fourth, we can say, documentation. What are the documents? What you need to collect? Like, as I mentioned, AOCs and ROCs, any signed agreements, assessment questionnaires and responses, right? Maybe their risk assessments. What are the mitigation plans if they have any risks identified, right? What are the incidents that occurred? What was the root cause analysis? Like, you can simply ask them for all these evidences, right, and store them in your SharePoint or maybe the TPRM tool. Remember, evidence is your defense, right? You can show this to your auditor that yes, even at third parties, are compliant because we have audited them. Lastly, regular communication. Treat your vendors as extensions of your team, right? Establish like regular touch points with them, like conduct quarterly business reviews, annual compliance discussions, like ensure they are well aware of what is the incident notification procedure that they have to follow. Now, these are the best practices you can implement to maybe, elevate your TPRM from a reactive compliance to, we can say, proactive risk reduction. Now, which with this uh, brings us to the end of our webinar. Before ending this session, I would like to just summarize what are some of the key takeaways that you can get from this session. Firstly, let's say that third party risk is an organizational risk, right? You are liable for the vendor failures, right? Then requirement 12.8, it is very comprehensive. It covers the whole vendor life cycle. We can also say that we can also take a suggestion that spreadsheets are outdated. We have to start using proper TPRM tools that can give us better insight and centralized inventory to manage these vendors. Then fourthly, we can say that annual assessments is minimum, right? We have to consider frequent monitoring for these third parties, right? So that we are ensured that everything is in place and is still compliant for us. And lastly, we can say that responsibility matters a lot. The responsibility matrix that you'd be creating, it will provide you clarity. It will prevent any blame game during the incidents or any audits, right? And we can ensure of a third party risk management program. Third. Okay, now we can also say that there are some of the action items that you need to take care of, right? Right now, what you can do is audit your current vendor inventory, see if it is complete and current or not, right? See if your vendors have been categorized by the risk level, right? Review all your agreements, vendor agreements. Are they mentioning the PCI DSS requirements? Are they giving us properly what is the liability, who is liable for the things, for the breaches, the incident notifications, and so on, right? Maybe also request your vendors for their latest AOCs. Keep it with them. Keep it with you. Prepared for your next audits, right? Create an extensive responsibility matrix for all your critical third-party service providers, right? And then also, conduct annual assessments to ensure that we are still compliant, we are updated with everything. And finally, consider implementing a third party risk management platform, because it will help you. The automated procedures will help you a lot, and it is always better than manual processes. Lastly, I would just like to conclude by saying that third parties, they aren't just vendors, right? They are potential gateways to breaches, and they can cost millions if it is exploited. But by mastering this requirement 12.8, you're not just checking a compliance checkbox, but you're fortifying your entire cardholder data environment, right? And start with your inventory audit this week. To be honest, your QSA and the acquiring bank will thank you. Now, I would really love to hear any of the questions that you might have, and I would like to open the floor for the question and answers. Anyone? I would really like to hear from someone. If you have any queries, if you want me to explain maybe any particular point that you might have missed, just let me know. Okay, if we are not like getting any questions, I already received a few questions over the email before this webinar. So I would really like to maybe cover that up first. Yeah. So yes, firstly, somebody asked us, what's the difference between a vendor and a third party? Well, a very good question, to be honest, right? A vendor is somebody who provides us with a product or service, but a third party is like an external entity that can impact your systems or maybe the cardholder data environment, right? So from PCI perspective, what matters mainly is the access or the impact to the cardholder data environment, not just the term vendor, right? So I hope that answers your question. uh yes, I also received another question. Let's see. Why do we see a PCI DSS certified firms experiencing breaches of sensitive data? Is there some shortfall in the audit process? Okay, really nice question, to be honest. So why do we mostly see that these PCI DSS certified firms are experiencing these breaches? Because as I mentioned, they do not have a sustainable third party risk management program. They might be missing some of the risks they do not know of, right? Like anything can happen here, right? Security can weaken after any audit, right? Scope may be misjudged, third parties may introduce the risk, or there are like subcontractors which you are not aware of, right? Okay. uh, yeah, that is all the questions that I had from my end. If there are any questions, I would really like to hear again. The floor is open for anybody. You can type your questions on the chat or maybe turn on your mic and speak. Okay, I believe we do not have any questions as such from anyone, but nevertheless, I am still available for everyone. So if any queries are there or you need any more clarification, you can simply connect with us. And last, before signing off, I would just like to add one more, one line, which is don't let the third parties become your silent PCI DSS Achilles heel. On that note, I would like to conclude this webinar. Slides, recordings, and resources can be shared separately over the email. Please connect with us. You can directly connect with me or reach out at CyberCube for personalized guidance. Thank you for your time. Stay compliant, stay secure.